Hi everyone, my name is Frédérick Lavoie. I'm a Canadian writer and a journalist. I'm speaking from Montreal now, in confinement as many people. In 2018, I published this book, Avant l'après, Voyage à Cuba avec George Orwell, in French, as you can see, in which I was talking about 3 trips I made in Cuba in 2016 and 2017, trying to talk about nowadays Cuba, what is changing, what is not changing. And now, since then, the book has been translated into English. The title is Orwell in Cuba, How 1984 Came to be Published in Castro's Twilight. And it's about to come out with Talonbooks in the next few months. We cannot predict anything with this crisis, but it's due in Canada and in the US in May and June. Thanks to also Donald Winkler for this great translation. And I'm going to read a chapter of the book, a very special chapter that I wrote to be read in public, in front of an audience in Cuba during the Havana Book Fair in 2017. So I wrote this chapter and I made changes up to the point when I read it in Spanish, actually. But then after, I didn't change anything. That was a bit of the challenge with this chapter that is called An Anticipatory Tale. I won't read it all. I'll stop at some point because it's quite long, but I think you'll get an idea of the idea of the chapter. I'm sitting in front of an audience. I'm speaking words into a microphone. My voice resonates in the room. Can I be heard in the back? A few people have come to listen to me. I'm a Canadian writer invited to the 26th edition of the Havana International Book Fair. I'm reading a Spanish translation of a chapter from Avant l'après, Voyage à Cuba avec George Orwell, still being written. I recognize a few faces. I see Danielle and Fabricio, of course. They are 2 of the main characters in my book. If you've read the previous pages, you already know that. During my other visits here, I've spent hours talking with them about Cuba, 1984, George Orwell, literature, and many other things. In September, before leaving the island, thinking I would not return before the publication of this book, I asked them if they would let me share our discussions. Up to then, their agreement had been only tacit. Danielle replied that he didn't care, that I could quote him as much as I wanted and just as I wanted. The same for Fabricio. That is what I've done. Another person, absent today, told me that if ever she had to leave Cuba for good one day, she would not want it to be because of me. It would be because she had herself chosen to do so. I could tell the story of her life, but she asked me not to reveal her name. That's what I've done. In my opinion, she's overestimated my importance and that of my writings. But she and you know it better than I do. Here, even now, you never can tell. I set my eyes once more on the people gathered before me. I recognize several faces, but not all. Do they understand what's happening? The future is a time that is by definition unforeseeable. The variables that must come together to transform it into the present are so many and so varied that any attempt to predict it is doomed to be inexact, at least in part. All it would take, for example, is for one person in the room to stand up and cut me off for the fragile control I am exerting over the immediate future between these 4 walls to break down. I look at my hands. They are trembling slightly. I'm nervous. It's that I know what's coming, if everything proceeds as planned. Still, I don't think I'll cause a huge scandal, and even less that I'll be stopped or thrown out of the country. It's just that I hate awkward situations, especially if I'm to blame for them. And I think I'm going to create one. Today, tomorrow, or another day, A rumor will perhaps circulate by word of mouth or through the independent media online that a Canadian writer pronounced words that people prefer not to say aloud in public in Cuba. If ever this event is discussed in Granma or Juventud Rebelde, it will be in one of two ways. Either it will be said that Frédérick Lavoie, a Canadian writer, read an excerpt from his next book dealing with Cuba without revealing the contents of this excerpt, or they will denounce the excerpt's content without citing them and without saying who is the author and in what context he read it aloud. On entering the country a few days ago, I carefully read the warning on the customs declaration form. The importation or exportation of explosives, drugs, narcotics, psychotropic substances, as well as literature, articles, and objects that are obscene, pornographic, or posing a threat to the national interest is forbidden. But how to know if these sheets of paper I'm holding in my hands and that I had in my baggage when coming through customs are posing a threat to the national interest? Who has the power and the competence to judge? In the year 2000, during a stay in Havana, an Indian journalist I know met a Ghanaian medical student whose copy of 1984 had been confiscated on his arrival in Cuba. You have to believe that he had happened upon a custom officer who was mad about literature. Then suddenly, in February of last year, at the same book fair, without any law or official rule being changed, the publisher Arte Literatura made the same Orwell novel available to Cuban readers. All that is to tell you that even if I am nervous, even if I tremble, I'm not really afraid of expressing myself before you today. More than 1 million of my fellow Canadian citizens come to Cuba every year and are treated like royalty by Cubans and the country's authorities, even when they behave terribly. Why should it be any different for me? Many people in Havana have already warned me that the book fair is one of the few events, along with the contemporary art biennale, when Cubans and invited foreigners can permit themselves to widen the scope of free speech in the country. Tania Bruguera already put this to the test with Tatlin's Murmur No. 6 in 2009. When she installed a microphone in a closed room during the biennial so that citizens could express themselves openly, she was not sanctioned by the authorities. They only denounced her action. On the other hand, when she declared 5 years later that she intended to repeat this performance on Revolution Square, she found herself in a lot of trouble, arrested for resistance and public disorder, and her passport confiscated. In 1984, George Orwell imagined a society where a single party in power was able not only to control the present, but also the past and even the future. I don't know if the English writer really believed in the possible advent of such a regime, one that was foolproof and indestructible. Myself, I do not believe in it. As Daniel demonstrated in his excellent essay on 1984, by reducing totalitarian reality purely to its political dimension, Orwell omitted other potential sources of corruption in the system that could, in the long run, threaten its survival. Anyone who has lived through a special period, Daniel emphasizes, knows that the shortages push people to act outside the ethical and ideological norms they have up to that point respected. And that is what marks the beginning of the end of a system. Dictatorship always live on time borrowed from freedom. That is why they don't like the future. It frightens them more than anything else. Seeking absolute control over the lives of their citizens, they impose on themselves the Herculean task of having to forestall all dissent, any flaw in the system. But that is tiring. This constant vigilance and repression. It tires the people, but also the regime. All the more in that, unlike democratic regimes, dictatorships have no horizon on which to lean if they want to regenerate themselves. No election to lose, and so no time in a position relieved of the burden of power. Dictatorships are condemned to proclaiming themselves eternal and trying to be so. That is why they age so badly. In his dystopia, George Orwell wanted to resolve the problem of sustainability by placing in power an immortal Big Brother. Immortal because imaginary. Except that in the real world, as we can see clearly in our time, neither the big nor the little brothers are eternal. In 1956, 6 years after the publication of 1984, an ambitious young man who was not yet 30 years old at the time, but who was to make his mark on the history of his little country and that of the entire world, declared, "The spots disappear, the people remain." Is it the small fund of humility, well camouflaged behind an outsized ego, that pushed him to demand that no statue in his likeness be erected after he died? Or would it rather be because, all-powerful in his lifetime, he feared the day when he would have to look up from his grave and see his bronze statue being thrown to the pavement without his being able to do anything about it? I stopped for a moment to take a sip of water. I cast my gaze over the room. I observed that, up to now, I have been able to maintain control of the future. I continue reading. I hate Fidel Castro. I hate Raúl Castro. I'll stop here. There's more. I explain why I say that. And this was read the 14th of February 2017 at the Havana Book Fair. And so the book is coming out. I don't know how you'll be able to get it, but I'm sure things will get better soon. And so it's called Orwell in Cuba, How 1984 Came to be Published in Castro's Twilight. It's at Talonbooks, and it's been translated by Donald Winkler. And I'm Frédérick Lavoie. Thank you, and good night and good luck.